This is a quick summary rundown of them. We've got 5 here: necessary, sufficient, correlation, causation, numbers, percentages. Going on to others: circular reasoning, unrepresentative sample, false analogy, and so on, and then even more. And I covered them with broad strokes in the past, but tonight I want to go deeper and start looking at some of the specifics here, and of course, address your questions, field your questions as they come up, and also get your feedback on some of the examples that we've got going on here. So if you aren't clear on any of these in the general sense, feel free to ask, but I'll also invite you to look at the recording from the previous week and the week before that, where we got into some specific details on each of these flaws, speaking broadly, of course. So specific, broad kind of contradictions there, but I'm going to go deeper tonight is the bottom line. So first example, it's a classic one. It's not super offensive. It's regarding pizza this time. So sufficient, necessary, condition, confusion. This is reversing conditions. Classic logical terms for this are converse and inverse. You may also see this referred to as reversal and negation, or mistaken reversal, mistaken negation is one common way to refer to this. So basically reversing things around the arrow incorrectly, also known as an incorrect translation of some kind. So if we have given, pizza will make me happy, or pizza requires that I be happy. If that's given, an incorrect translation would be reversing those variables around the arrow without negating. So a flawed conclusion or a flawed inference would be the converse, or a reversal, saying happiness requires pizza. But if I'm happy, is that because I ate pizza? No, it could be due to a variety of other factors. Lots of other things could make me happy as well, not just pizza. Sunshine, puppies, getting 180, all of those things could make you happy. Pizza is not the only thing. Pizza obviously helps though. Inverse would be negating both variables around the arrow without reversing the order. So saying, if I don't eat pizza, then I won't be happy. That's also problematic given the original. We said in the original evidence, pizza is sufficient to make me happy. But again, pizza may not be required. Lacking pizza alone doesn't guarantee that I'm not happy, because other things could still make me happy even in the absence of pizza, like burritos or sushi could also make me happy. Pizza is not the only thing that would get the job done. So that's the quick two minutes on that. I've got a video that goes into this in more depth called Conditional Rules, Failed Contrapositive Attempts, and it's in the Logic Games Foundation section of the course, lesson number 3. Now I've got another example here. I brought this up in the past as well. Let's say we have given, marijuana use clearly leads to heroin addiction. After all, every heroin addict started with marijuana. So I'm going to invite anyone who would like to just jump in and type in the chat or unmute yourself and just share with me what's the evidence in this statement. We'll break it down bit by bit, piece by piece.
Is it that every heroin addict started with marijuana?
Perfect. Awesome. So evidence indicated by after all, every heroin addict started with marijuana. We only have an evidence indicator here. We do not have a conclusion indicator. Sometimes you have one or the other or neither. In this case, we're lucky to have at least one, which tells us that the other part must therefore be the conclusion. So we have here a flawed conclusion. I'm telling you it's flawed. And after all, this is a slide titled Logical Reasoning Flaws. So it's there. I'm giving you that one. What's the flawed conclusion here?
That marijuana use leads to heroin addiction because every heroin addict started with marijuana, but isn't it wrong to say the word every in every statement? Because isn't it hard to find evidence that would fit with, extreme language?
Yeah, it would be hard. I mean, that's an extreme claim here, but it's evidence, so we're to take it as given. Now, if they're making a claim about every heroin addict, that's a strong claim and is pretty unlikely. Have we comprehensively cataloged every heroin addict throughout history, throughout time? There's probably, I don't know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands over millennia. Who knows? That's a lot of people. Have we documented all of them? Do we know that we've documented all of them? There's the unknowns, right? So it's hard to say, but that is their claim in the evidence with the word every. So we are to take that as given. What we're looking to evaluate here is the conclusion specifically. So let's diagram this. So I left here some blanks, and we can fill in what's the evidence, what's the flawed conclusion, and then we'll take a moment to figure out the valid conclusion. And so, yeah, Jasmine, exactly. The first sentence, marijuana use clearly leads to heroin addiction, is the conclusion in this argument. So I'll diagram here in the chat. Evidence is every heroin addict started with marijuana. So if you are a heroin addict, we know that you had marijuana first or prior. So H requires M is the evidence. And then conclusion, how would you diagram that conditionally? Feel free to just type in the chat or call out. Perfect. We got here from Colin, M requires H. Excellent. So marijuana use clearly leads to heroin addiction. So this is the reversal I was talking about previously, where it's the reversal. It's also known as the converse in logic land. So we're reversing the variables around the arrow without negating. That's an improper or incorrect translation, and it's a failed contrapositive attempt, as I would call it. Now, a valid conclusion would be to simply restate the evidence, which is somewhat circular, but it's inferable, or we could do the contrapositive. What would the contrapositive of the evidence be? Well, the contrapositive is reversing the variables around the arrow and negating both of them. So both reversing and negating is the correct translation. And Jasmine's got it here in the chat, not M requires not H. So if you didn't have marijuana, then you must not have had heroin, because heroin requires marijuana. That would be a valid translation, and that's based on the given information, so we're to take that as true as well. So the contrapositive is a valid or correct inference, and for a must be true question, that contrapositive could be the correct answer. Now, in a general must be true question, there could be lots of other things going on as well. This is fairly simple, and for a flaw question, they're not looking for contrapositives, but I'm simply using this one stimulus or argument to do a variety of things with it, to analyze it in a variety of ways. And that's something I really like to emphasize if you're looking to get a higher score, is to take the same stimulus and analyze it from multiple perspectives. Really valuable to be able to do that. And I could easily see on the LSAT, one person could write the stimulus, and then somebody else could give it the question stem and the choices. Once you have an argument, a lot of ways you can analyze it. You could strengthen, you could weaken, you could point out flaws, you could create a parallel argument, lots of directions you can take it in. So this discussion of flaws doesn't just apply to flaw questions. It could apply to a variety of question types as well, in particular, weakened questions as well, as we discussed last night. There are ways to attack an argument further if it does have a flaw, by exposing that gap, by making that gap more problematic. So here is my diagramming of this particular argument. You see we've got the flawed conclusion that they drew, reversing the variables around the arrow. You've also got the inverse, which would be negating both variables without reversing. And then you've got the contrapositive, or the conclusion, which is simply reversing and negating, which is valid, unlike the previous two that are flawed. So you've got the answers right there, as we discussed in the chat also. Any questions about this example up to this point? Okay, so if not, we could go on to the next example, which is correlation, causation, confusion. So two things are associated. As one goes up, the other goes up, or maybe as one goes up, the other goes down. And assuming that because they increase or decrease along with each other in some direction, that there must be some sort of causal relationship between the two. There are a variety of alternate possibilities or explanations, and pointing out those alternative possibilities or explanations could problematize the argument, meaning that they could weaken the argument, and simply describing those possibilities could be showing how that argument is flawed or potentially flawed in some way. So it could be simply be a coincidence, could be a random association, or there could be a third variable causing both, or the causal relationship could be reversed. And we don't always know. You don't have to know the answer or the reason why it's flawed or potentially problematic. You simply have to point out those possibilities, and that is often enough. So here's one where it could simply be a coincidence. Maybe not. This is just a joke from a comic I like. So it could be a coincidence. That's one possibility. I'm not going to describe the joke because describing jokes is just lame. But here's another one. It could also be a coincidence here if there's these two things that basically have no obvious relationship at all, where we have newspaper sales and movie scores and such. Total coincidence. What do newspaper ad sales have to do with a movie? It's total coincidence. No obvious relationship in one way or the other. Now, this one also, temperature, number of pirates, they're increasing in tandem. But again, no obvious relationship there. You'd really be stretching to try and find a connection between those two things. Just again, to illustrate that things can increase side by side at the same general rate with no obvious connection. Most likely solution is simply it's coincidence, it's random. If you look at enough things, you'll probably be able to draw a connection between two of them. And we're, again, selection bias, you're ignoring all the things that don't correlate with that. Like temperature and number of pirates could go hand in hand together, but number of people taking the LSAT might not be increasing at the same rate because not everything's related, not everything goes up or down at the same time. Now here's one common example, ice cream sales and murders both increase over the same period. What's one possible explanation of this? A third variable that could explain both of those. Some of you may have come across this before.
Stress eating?
Stress eating, yeah, cool. If you're stressed about the murders, you might buy more ice cream, or you're stressed, you murder people, and you buy more ice cream.
Ice cream trucks and killing people.
Yeah, ice cream trucks are driving into people, right? So that would be if one is causing the other, totally possible also. But I think the biggest one, I'll give anyone else who wants to share their thoughts before I share my thoughts.
Temperature.
Temperature, yeah, we got a couple people saying temperature. That's absolutely correct. That's most commonly given as the reason for both of these things. So obviously, as it gets hotter out, people buy more ice cream. Also, people get more angry. Their temperature, their personal tempers are more sensitive, and so they explode more. And so that's said to be the third variable causing both of these. But ice cream sales and murders don't necessarily relate directly to each other. One is not causing the other. That third external factor, not even mentioned, could be the actual cause and is maybe the most likely cause. Now, here's another one. We have the cigarette consumption and the price of cigarettes. And so people might say the causality is in one direction, when in reality, it's in the other direction. So maybe as cigarette consumption decreased, they had to raise the price per pack to make the same profits. Or maybe as you raise the price, cigarette consumption drops because of supply and demand. So the causality could potentially go in either direction. Obviously, it's super complicated, especially if you're factoring in taxes, and taxes vary by state. And maybe cigarette demand is somewhat inelastic, meaning that it's not sensitive to price because people are addicted. So a variety of potential explanations there, but it's not completely obvious that the causality is only in one direction. I don't want to get too mired in the specifics here because the bottom line, the point I'm raising here is simply that causality could be reversed, not necessarily one way. Okay, so let's go to the next one here, numbers and percentages. And this is a really common area of confusion. Obviously, I know that a lot of pre-law people aren't super into math. I'm personally not into math. That has never really been my thing. I've always been more of a humanities person. So these have been a little harder for me to personally get a grasp on. So that's why I slowed down for this one. And I covered a variety of different ways, this could play out. So let's say a number could be pretty high, but still be a low percentage. And that's not always obvious. We hear large numbers, we think big. Our brains evolutionarily weren't meant to be looking at percentages and graphs and charts and such. So 500 people could be a high percentage of people in a small town that has only 501. But if you're talking a big city, it's actually a relatively smaller percentage. So don't automatically assume that a big number will be a big percentage of the total. Then a small number could be a big percentage of a total. So 5 pizza pies would be a big percentage of what you're eating in a day or in a week. But it could be a low percentage if you're looking at it as a fraction of a pizzeria's daily sales. So a small number isn't always going to be a low percentage. It could actually be a big percentage. Everything is relative. everything is context dependent. So when you see a high number or a low number in a stimulus, always think outside the box. Could a low number be a high percentage and vice versa? Lots of ways it could play out. And then we also have increases and decreases. So if the number of young people increases from 1,000 to 3,000, even though the number of young people has increased, it doesn't mean that the relative percentage of the population has increased, because we're not looking at the total pie, the total population of people in the town overall. It's possible that the town's population exploded across all demographics, across all ages, and maybe the percentage of old people increased even more. So an increase in the number of people doesn't mean an overall percentage increase in terms of them taking up a larger part of the pie. We need to know more about all the groups involved, not just one select specific group. And then same goes for decreases. The flip side of that, if we have the number of young people decreasing, it doesn't mean that they lost percentage overall. Maybe even if they decrease from 3,000 people to 1,000 people, they could actually become the majority of residents in the town. It all depends on what happens with the older people, that population, that demographic. If their population decreased even more, then the 1,000 people could actually be the majority, entirely possible. So again, we need to know the totals. We need to know all of the context. And when you're looking at alternate possibilities and alternate explanations, that's the kind of thing they're going to be bringing up to point out, because it's the stuff that they're not talking about. And that's a big theme on the LSAT overall. What are the things they're not telling us about, the things that are kind of hidden? So even in a logic game, if we're talking about positive variables, what about the negative variables? What's happening with them? You always want to be thinking of all the parties, all the people, all the variables that are in the picture overall, not just the ones that are being explicitly mentioned. Then we have another example here with CD sales. If the CD sales are increasing from 1 million to 5 million, doesn't mean that their percentage of sales overall out of all CD sales has increased overall. Although that's a 5x increase, maybe other CD sales are increasing even more. Again, about the totals. This is just another example of the same thing. And then same goes for a drop in sales of CDs. If the sales are cut in half, they could still have the majority. Even if they're dropping, even if they've decreased and lowered, maybe they still have a large percentage of sales, and maybe other CDs sales dropped even more. So everything depends on the total picture that we're looking at, all groups, all variables. So any questions about numbers and percentages? I know that was a lot there.
I'm trying to see if I understand this correctly. So what you're saying is, in mathematical terms, they're giving us the numerator, but we don't know what the denominator is. So we can't make a actual assumption on whether it goes up or down because we don't know the denominator.
Yeah, it's a perfect way to look at it. That wouldn't apply to every single example, I think, but it would apply to a lot of them.
All right, cool.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it's a good way to think about it. So failure to consider alternate causes and explanations, and that could come up in a variety of different contexts that we even apply to, I think, most or all of the ones I previously covered tonight, but it's also a catch-all for things that don't fall within those categories specifically, especially when you're engaging in a more informal sense. This can come up. So I think this was I would put this one in big headlines. If anything else, I would stick this one front and center. Consider alternatives. Consider alternatives. Don't take anything for granted as being the exclusive cause or explanations. Things are typically complicated enough that there are alternate considerations that you can bring up. And again, the pizza happy example is a perfect example of this. Both the converse and the inverse, the reversal and the negation, they both fail to consider the possibility that something other than pizza could make me happy. Now, you probably got that earlier, but it came up in two different ways, two different framings, both communicating the same idea. And interestingly, the converse and the inverse are the contrapositives of each other, weirdly enough, because they're both doing only half of the translation. And those halves are actually, the reversal and the negation are logically equivalent to each other. Now, one big thing to look at is moderate versus extreme language. You'll often see that the evidence is fairly moderate, and then the conclusion is going far beyond that. And that's really a huge problem. If it were the reverse, if we had a moderate conclusion and extreme evidence, well, that would be fine, because the extreme evidence is to be taken as given. It's not open to question, and drawing a relatively more moderate conclusion is, well, that's perfectly fine. Extreme to moderate is okay because the conclusion is more narrower than the evidence, but going from moderate given information in the evidence to an extreme conclusion is stepping outside the boundaries of what's reasonable. And so if we have evidence suggesting something, that's not a guarantee to say that the meteorites must have killed off the dinosaurs. It's certainly a possibility, but there may be evidence supporting other alternative hypotheses as well. So suggesting is relatively moderate, fairly reasonable, but then to say must have is far too extreme. So too big a jump there. And this comes up in a variety of contexts. And it's another catch-all framing like number 4, the previous example with alternate possibilities, alternate explanations, way to think about it in general. Conditional claims are by their nature very extreme. And they are, again, failing to consider alternate possibilities, alternate explanations. And so, again, moderate evidence, you can only go so far. And if you're thinking about the degree of certainty in the conclusion or the category of things they're discussing, it should typically match. So if the evidence is probably, the conclusion should also be probably or relatively more moderate, as just one example there. Any questions on this one?
Can you go over it one more time?
Yeah, sure. Any particular part of that?
About the dinosaurs example and specifics.
Yeah, sure. So if they're saying the evidence suggests something, that means that we have at least some support pointing in that direction. But if you think about it, you often see like a scientific study will make a relatively moderate claim, and then clickbait journalism will exaggerate the headline to get the clicks, and they'll go much farther than that to make the conclusion of the study seem much more likely than the evidence actually suggested. So if the evidence suggests the meteorites killed the dinosaurs, that means there's something pointing in that direction, but it's not guaranteed. The scientists are saying that this is one possibility, but there may be other possible explanations as well, like volcanic eruptions putting smoke in the air that blocks out the sun that cools the earth. That's another possibility. It's not necessarily meteorites specifically, but meteorites may have been a contributing factor, or we have some reason to believe. But some reason is like saying the word some, and some as a quantity is not majority, and it's also not absolute guarantee. So a conclusion saying must have killed off is far too extreme. Does that clear that up? Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so let's go to number 6, circular reasoning, also known as begging the question. And this is really when an argument is giving the same exact evidence and conclusion, or they're not really giving any new information at all to support their conclusion. And so in this example, John is mad because he's clearly very angry right now. They're really just repeating themselves. And it sounds ridiculous, but this does happen on the LSAT occasionally, and they're really just using synonyms without adding anything new. Why is John clearly very angry? What evidence do we have to support that? Is John's face red? Is he yelling? Is he punching the wall? We don't know. We have nothing along those lines. We have no details supporting this. They're just saying John's mad because he's angry. Well, you didn't really say very much there to support it, so this is circular. And you repeat yourself enough, it may stick in people's minds, but there's no actual evidence there, so this is flawed reasoning for that reason. Any questions on this one?
I don't have a question on this one. I guess it's more so a statement that I'm just not too sure on. I've come across a few of these using circular reasoning, and I feel like the LSAT writers really do a good job at hiding the circular reasoning. I've really been getting stumped on them, and then when I go back after getting the wrong answer, I like, oh, okay, honestly, hats off to the LSAT writers, because I think that they do a really good job with either complicated language or extremely vague language when they use circular reasoning.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that they are very good at masking it. And part of how they mask it is just including lots of filler. If they include filler that's irrelevant to the core of the argument, you get wrapped up in analyzing that filler. These examples are obviously a bit more pure to really illustrate the point, but there could be other sentences in there that have nothing to do with anything at all, and they're throwing you off. Or if they're making it on a more technical topic that pre-law students typically aren't as familiar with, that can also make it tougher to actually dig into. Like if they use multisyllabic scientific words, or if they use lots of formal logic-y terms, or philosophy or morality, that can often hide it as well. But if you can recognize the simpler examples, then at least you've built the groundwork to recognize them in tougher contexts. Yeah, that's a good point. They are very good at that. Let's look at number 7, unrepresentative sample. And unrepresentative samples can come up in a variety of different places. We did an example earlier with a student talking about a study involving old people with insomnia, and then talking about old people in general. Old people with insomnia specifically is not a representative sample of old people overall or of people in general, period. That's one example from an actual LSAT question in the 60s. And then this example here, the person is saying they listened to several indie rock albums, and then they're drawing a conclusion about rock music in general. So of course, indie rock albums specifically, that's only one genre or subgenre of rock. You can't draw a conclusion about rock music overall simply on the basis of indie rock specifically. Have you tried classic rock? Have you tried alternative rock? Have you tried pop rock? Lots of other varieties this person hasn't considered. And this is also actually an example of going from moderate to extreme depending on how you frame it. You could say that the indie rock album specifically is a qualified, more limited group, and then they've made the more extreme claim about rock music overall. That's why I said moderate to extreme is kind of like a catch-all category there, but it can be a useful framing device to better understand these. You could also think of this as a part-to-whole flaw in particular, saying that indie rock in particular is representative of rock music overall, or what is true of one subgenre of rock is true of rock as a whole. So it could be, this example could actually be framed as part to whole. I framed it here as an unrepresentative sample, but I think both interpretations here would actually be valid. All right, let's go to number 8 with false analogy. And so arguments by analogy are incredibly common in general, as well as on the LSAT. An analogy is simply saying that two things that are similar in one way must be similar in another way in particular. And I've got a quote here from an astronomer saying that because two things are similar in nature, that they must be similar in other ways also. So they say that animals have 7 windows, nostrils, eyes, ears, mouth, and because animals in nature are apparently, and planets are similar in lots of ways in nature, therefore planets, there must also be 7 planets. So to me, this argument seems completely nonsensical, but the idea is that they say from this and many other similarities in nature. I think that's the key. So because these things are similar in many ways in nature, and of course, very conveniently, it's too tedious for this guy to enumerate, then the number of planets must be 7 overall. So they've drawn a very extreme claim based on things being similar in certain key ways, and this guy hasn't even bothered to explain what those similarities are. So this is really a questionable argument here. Any questions on the false analogy?
What would the answer choices look like, and what would the correct answer choice look like?
I think the answer choice for this one would probably be something like my more general abstract description here. Assumes that things that are similar in one key respect must be similar in all respects, or things that are similar in a particular respect must be similar in all respects. And you can look it up. I mean, I would suggest going to any flaw question in a logical reasoning section that involves abstract language and scanning through the choices and defining each of them, looking up the words, looking up the phrases, because they do repeat themselves again and again and again. I think that would be a really useful drill or exercise to work through. And I actually have, and I'll share this in just a moment, or I'll share this at the end of class. I've shared it previously too. A list of logical reasoning questions where many of them in parentheses, we have the classic logical fallacies that they're exhibiting. And so you can actually go to a given question and see, I want to look at a false analogy logical reasoning question. And you'll see several examples. All right, here we go. So this is a list of flawed reasoning questions here. We've got going all the way down the list. Circular reasoning, correlation, causation, irrelevant evidence, unrepresentative sample. And I'll put the link in the chat here just so you can see. So you can go to that list and pull up.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So you can go to that list and pull up a bunch of logical reasoning questions of lots of particular types. Flaw in particular, you've got many of them cataloged by their exact logical fallacy. And so if you look at the answer choices there, you'll see the exact wording. Now, equivocation is one that comes up a lot. And this is a pretty tricky one because it involves using key terms with their secondary and tertiary definitions. So not your conventional everyday speech, your conventional everyday language for the flaws or for those key words, but using it in multiple ways. So here we have, you said you're a person of faith, but clearly not the case. You don't even have faith in my ability to fly this helicopter to Jupiter. So person of faith here, and then faith in my ability. The problem here, they mean different things. So does anybody want to describe their understanding of those differences?
Faith in the first sentence is talking about a person, more of a person of a religion, whereas faith in the second, in the conclusion, you're basically saying you don't believe in my ability.
Sweet, perfect. Yeah, so person of faith meaning a person who believes in God, a person who's religious, and then you don't even have faith in my ability, meaning you don't believe I can do this. But not believing that you can do this is not the same thing as being a religious person. Two very different things. But because they use the same word faith, they're trying to call this person a hypocrite, essentially. And that's actually a lot of what they do with flaw of equivocation is calling someone a hypocrite. We're saying somebody, like one example that comes to mind for me is compromising on making a deal, like coming to the middle of a negotiation versus compromising on your morals. Two very different meanings of the word compromise being used interchangeably. So using a key term interchangeably, even though the definitions of the word in those different contexts would mean very different things. So that's using the term inconsistently. Then we have number 10, an ad hominem personal attack. That one, of course, is quite well known to, I think, everyone. And that one is when you're attacking someone's personal characteristics rather than the substance of their argument itself. So, of course, in this case, a record company executive who says illegal music downloads hurt record sales or illegal music downloads are a problem. The record company executive is obviously biased. Therefore, we shouldn't take what they say seriously. And this is a really tempting flaw, actually, because the record company executive does have reason to be biased. It is natural to expect that they would say illegal downloads are a problem. But that doesn't mean that they're wrong, is the thing. They could have a biased perspective. They could have reason to argue in one direction rather than another. But that reason alone isn't enough to dismiss their argument entirely. You actually have to look at what it is that they're advocating. You have to look at their evidence on its own merits specifically. Like if I say the LSAT is a good exam and there's reason to use it in the law school admission process, there are plenty of people who hate the LSAT for a variety of reasons. And they would say, oh, Steve, like you make your living in the LSAT industry. Of course you would say the LSAT's a good exam. You don't want to lose your livelihood. And of course, I do have a vested interest in the LSAT in particular, but that doesn't mean that the LSAT is automatically a bad exam or that my arguments have no merit. You actually have to look at my evidence. So if I present evidence talking about the LSAT's correlation with first-year law school grades or the kinds of skills that the LSAT tests being relevant to the kind of work you do in law school itself, you have to say, well, maybe 1L is not important, or maybe what you do in law school isn't important. Let's look at the bar exam, or let's look at what you do as an attorney. Those are reasonable counter arguments to my points, but you actually have to engage with me in that way if you want to make a logical argument there. And somebody just drew all over my screen, and I'm not sure how to get rid of it. That's funny. I have to work that out for the future. Let's see if I go to the next. Let me see if I stop the share and then I reshare. Will that make it go away? Haha, to whoever did that. I got rid of it. All right, so that's ad hominem. Any questions on that? All right, well, that's ad hominem. It does come up quite a bit, not all the time, but it does come up occasionally. All right, next we have a self-refuting argument. So an argument that's internally inconsistent, meaning that it's essentially self-contradictory. So you have two statements in the evidence, in the stimulus, that are at odds with each other and cannot both be true. And so I've got a quote from George Orwell's Animal Farm here. And interestingly, George Orwell also has the quote from 1984, the concept of doublethink, the idea that a person can hold two inconsistent or contradictory ideas in their head at the same time and believe both. So George Orwell was well acquainted with this sort of logical fallacy. And so we have here the idea that working Sundays is optional. If you take off Sunday, you're not penalized. But then they're also saying, in the final sentence, if you don't work Sunday, you have your rations cut in half. So if your rations are cut in half, you obviously are being penalized, and it's not really optional, at least if you don't want to suffer in some way. So this quote taken as a whole has contradictions, and each piece alone might be perfectly fine and to be taken as given, but if you put them all together, it simply does not work. So this would be a flawed statement when taken as a whole. It's internally inconsistent, self-contradictory is the idea. Any questions about this one? And an example of this in a more abstract sense might be something like the premises, when taken together, cannot all be true or cannot both be true. So they use a word like premise or assumption or evidence, something like that. They just use more abstract terms to refer to the same ideas. Let's look at number 12, false dilemma. So this is failing to consider that there may be more than two specific possibilities. This also relates to the idea of a middle ground, which we may also discuss here. So the fans of Breaking Bad will know what I'm talking about with this example here. But anyway, so the idea is that we have only two options. Either you take money from your rich friends or you start cooking and selling crystal meth. Those probably aren't the only two options you have, but Walter White, Breaking Bad, used that as a justification to go in one very questionable direction in Breaking Bad. So that's the idea, is that there could have been something else altogether. Maybe he could have worked overtime. Maybe he could have worked a second job. Maybe he could have taken out a loan. Maybe he could have started gambling. Lots of other things somebody could do other than going the Breaking Bad route and selling crystal meth. There are alternative possibilities in many cases, not only the two presented. And presenting only two options is an argumentative tactic used to say, well, one of those options is clearly ridiculous, therefore we should go the direction that I want to go in, which of course is very convenient for that person to justify their choice, but they are unfairly excluding all of those alternatives. So again, back to what I believe was number 4 earlier, the idea of failing to consider alternate possibilities and explanations. This idea comes up again and again and again in very different contexts. Any questions on this one? All right, let's go to number 13, overgeneralization. So this is a very broad one, and this relates to moderate evidence, extreme conclusion. This is a variation on that, where we're simply going way beyond the specifics of the evidence in particular. So this may be an example where we have like the unrepresentative sample, where we're talking about, let's say, old people who have insomnia, and then broadening that to old people in general, or everybody with insomnia in general, when the evidence was specifically about a limited group in particular, old people with insomnia. So broadening the scope of what they're talking about. And you'll see some explanations say outside the scope, which to me is a very lazy way of explaining why an answer choice is wrong. I think it's more useful to get into the specifics of exactly what about it was outside the scope. And so if we're talking about my example, it would be broadening from a very limited group and naming that group and then naming where they went too far and where the conclusion was outside the bounds of what was discussed in the evidence specifically. Questions on this one?
Yeah, I'm just curious, would the answer typically have like an all to all statement, or could it include like a most to all? Like, can it be like sort of a weak answer choice? Can it be like a most as opposed to an all in a sense?
Yeah, it could be. It could be. So when we're talking quantity words, really any quantity that's clearly, definitively larger than the initial quantity would be a problem. So if you were to go from few to most, that's a problem. Or if you were to go from few to all or few to majority, that's a problem. That's clearly a different number. It's clearly a different characterization. So if you can say definitively there's a difference there in what's being discussed, it's flawed. It's too extreme. But the answer is that overgeneralizations do not always have to include the word all.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And I would also look at, by the way, like qualifying words. So you could have extremes in the degree of certainty, and you could have extremes in the category of things or people they're discussing. So that would be like saying some people who versus most people who versus all people who. And then you could say most people who take the LSAT. And then you could say most people who take the LSAT and score 160 and above. Or you could say most people who take the LSAT and score 160 and above and study more than 10 hours a week. Very limited group. The more you narrow the scope of the group that you're talking about, the more reasonable it is. And then the more that you zoom out from that group, the more extreme and broad the claim is. So very important to look at all of those details. So we have here an example with overgeneralization. We're going from talking about the first year of law school and the first week of law school, and then jumping ahead to make a claim about all 3 years of law school. Now, of course, there's some reason to be concerned, of course, if you think the first week is difficult, but the first week does not represent necessarily the entire 3 years. So again, this is going to what may be an unrepresentative sample. It's going to also a part to whole problem here potentially. The first week is part of the 3-year experience, but does not necessarily reflect the entire 3 years. And again, they are overgeneralizing and going way beyond those 3 years in particular. So lots of potential problems with that one.
If this were sort of a strengthened question, I guess, how do we strengthen this or try to support it, if at all?
Yeah, sure. You could say, for example, that we had a study where we surveyed the last 5 years of law school graduates, and specifically those and only those who had extreme difficulty in the first year of law school the first week of law school ended up having a lot of problems over the course of the entire 3 years. So that would serve as evidence supporting this claim, where we would say, okay, well, if all of those people had trouble, then this person in particular is also fairly likely to have trouble throughout the 3 years. Not a guarantee, obviously, but it does support that argument. And then you could also argue the opposite, and you could say that there are tons of people who struggled the first week who ended up doing great in law school, passing the bar on their first try. They got over the hump, they got the resources they needed, and they finished 1L with flying colors. And then we could say it's very normal to struggle the first week. You'll be fine in the long run. But that's opening the door to new information, so that you could very easily make this a strengthening question or a weakening question with that new information provided to help or hurt the argument. And again, part to whole flaws as well as whole to part flaws. We've talked about part to whole flaws quite a bit here, where we're saying what's true of an individual portion is true of the entirety as a whole as well. And then you can break it down the other way and say that the entirety, that every single portion is that what's true of the whole is true of each individual part. So if we say, for example, that cake is sweet, that means that every single ingredient in cake must also be sweet, which may not be true. After all, you might add a little bit of salt, a pinch of salt, to the cake, which doesn't make the cake salty, but the cake does have that individual salty component. Or you're adding eggs to the cake. Eggs, as far as I know, are neither salty nor sweet. They're something else altogether. But the cake as a whole being sweet doesn't reflect the individual portions. So an example of that part to whole flaw, we have the particular example of Saul Goodman, one particular dishonest lawyer. And they're saying from him that therefore, on his example, that all lawyers must be thieves. But that one particular attorney may not be reflective of attorneys as a whole. And then whole to part flaw, just because one particular building is enormous doesn't mean that every single individual room in that building is also enormous. A big building can contain a small room. Like the closet might not be big, the toilet stalls might not be big, the offices may not be big, but the student center as a whole may be a very large building relative to the campus or relative to other student centers. And none of that matters anyway because everything's online now. Now, finally, number 15, absence of evidence flaws. And so that's saying that because we have failed to provide evidence or failed to learn the evidence doesn't mean that the evidence doesn't exist. It's possible that we don't have complete information at this particular moment in time, but we may gain that information in the future, or we may simply have not spoken or stated or learned that information quite just yet. And so I raised this example a few weeks ago, raising it again here. We have the example of we lack a scientific explanation of zombies. And they're concluding that voodoo could not possibly be a scientific enterprise. Anybody want to share their thoughts on this one? What are they failing to consider in this argument?
I'll try and tackle it. It's saying that just because we can't prove X, therefore the opposite must be true. And I might be flubbing it a little bit, but I recall a similar example that said there isn't proof of God, therefore God does not exist, which would be equally fallacious.
Yeah, awesome. You're exactly right. So because we haven't gotten the proof, therefore that explanation could not possibly be correct. Maybe our information and knowledge is simply incomplete at this particular moment in time, which is probably true of a lot of things, because if you look at the past, we've never had complete information yet. Why should this moment in time in 2020 be any different? We'll probably learn new things in the future. And so we have to keep the door open to new information and not be too confident in our understanding being complete at any one moment in time. And that's actually a really good idea for the LSAT in general, which is to remain humble and realize that there's only so much that you can conclude, only so many inferences you can derive on the basis of very limited information. And people typically on the LSAT, they make the mistake of assuming too much, of being too confident. And part of doing well on this is realizing just how little you know and drawing more limited conclusions rather than more extreme ones. My main reason for bringing up this example is the idea that because we've never gotten a scientific explanation, that we never could get one in the future. It's the big takeaway here. That's probably a good place to leave off here for tonight. These are all the classic logical fallacies that I thought would be useful to bring up tonight. And so this is going to end our series of flaw workshops. In the future, we'll talk about main points since Jasmine requested that. So anything main point related, please feel free to send it my way. Any general questions, anything that you think would be useful on main point. And thanks to everybody for coming in for your participation. I'll see you all very soon. Have a good night, all. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.